July 25th, 1943. 2:47 in the afternoon. The sky above Hamburg is no longer blue. It is silver. Silver with aluminum. Silver with steel. Silver with the slow mechanical crawl of engines that hum like a continent on the move. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Jonen sits strapped into the cockpit of his Bf-110, circling at 22,000 feet. He has flown 63 combat sorties. He has downed 11 Allied bombers. He knows fear. He knows adrenaline. He knows death. But this is something else. He tilts his head upward through the canopy glass and counts 10, 20, 50, 100. Then he stops counting, because the formations keep coming. They stretch from the western horizon to the edge of the sun, a solid wall of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, layered and staggered boxes, each one bristling with machine guns, each one trailing white contrails like threads stitching the sky together. His radio crackles. Another voice, younger, shaking. "Mein Gott, there must be 1,000 of them." Jonen doesn't reply. He doesn't need to. Because in that moment, 26,000 feet above the burning city of Hamburg, every pilot in the Luftwaffe understood the same truth. The fatherland was doomed. To understand what happened over Hamburg in the summer of 1943, you must first go back 2 years, to a time when Germany still believed it could win the war in the air. In 1940, the Luftwaffe was the most feared air force on the planet. It had crushed Poland in weeks. It had devastated Rotterdam in minutes. It had brought France to its knees and sent the British Expeditionary Force fleeing across the Channel at Dunkirk. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, stood beside Adolf Hitler in triumph, certain that air superiority belonged to the Reich. But Britain did not fall. Despite months of sustained bombing during the Blitz, despite the destruction of London, Coventry, and Birmingham, the Royal Air Force held, and more importantly, it evolved. By late 1940, the British had learned a brutal lesson. Bombers alone cannot win wars. You need fighters. You need radar. You need coordination. You need will. And by 1942, Britain had something even more dangerous: America. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it brought with it not just men and ships, but an industrial engine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Wichita began producing bombers at a rate that defied comprehension. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engined heavy bomber capable of carrying 4,000 pounds of explosives deep into enemy territory, rolled off assembly lines by the dozen, every day, every week, every month. By early 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces had established the 8th Air Force in England, stationed across dozens of airfields in East Anglia. Their mission was simple in concept, catastrophic in execution: strategic bombing. Destroy Germany's war industry, cripple its infrastructure, break the will of its people. The Americans believed in daylight precision bombing. Unlike the British, who flew at night and carpet-bombed entire cities, the Americans insisted they could hit factories, oil refineries, and rail yards with pinpoint accuracy. They believed their bombers, armored, armed, and flying in tight defensive formations, could survive without fighter escort deep into German airspace. They were wrong. In the first 6 months of 1943, American losses were staggering. Raids on Wilhelmshaven, Weggessek, and Bremen saw bombers shot down by the dozens. German Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-110s tore through the formations with 20mm cannons and rocket pods. Flak batteries surrounded every major city, filling the sky with exploding steel. Entire squadrons were wiped out before they reached their targets. The 8th Air Force was bleeding. But it did not stop, because the logic of attrition was shifting. For every bomber the Germans shot down, America built 5 more. For every pilot killed, 10 more were trained. The Reich could not replace neither planes nor men at that rate. And everyone, from Washington to Berlin, knew it. By mid-1943, the 8th Air Force had reorganized. Tactics improved. Formation discipline tightened. New bomber groups arrived weekly, and in July, they prepared for their most ambitious raid yet. Operation Gomorrah. The target? Hamburg.
Aboard the B-17 Memphis Belle II, flying in the lead formation of the 91st Bomb Group, 2nd Lieutenant Daniel Rothman sat in the bombardier's seat, eyes locked on the Norden bomb site. The target was the Blohmen-Voss shipyard, one of the largest U-boat construction facilities in Europe. Intelligence said the yard was still operational despite the previous night's RAF raid. Rothman's job was to put a 500-pound bomb through its roof. But first, they had to survive the next 30 minutes. The flak started at 20,000 feet. Black puffs of smoke erupted in clusters, each one a 105mm shell exploding with enough force to shred aluminum skin and pulp human flesh. The concussions rocked the plane. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage like hail. Behind Rothman, waist gunner Staff Sergeant Eddie Kowalski gripped his .5/8 caliber Browning, scanning the sky for fighters. He'd seen FW-190s before, fast, brutal, and unforgiving. But so far the German interceptors were hanging back, wary of the formation's overlapping fields of fire. That wouldn't last. "Fighters, 11 o'clock high," the call came from the top turret. Kowalski swung his gun left. 2 Bf-109s dove through the formation, cannons flashing. 1 B-17 in the neighboring group staggered, its No. 3 engine trailing fire. The crew bailed out, tiny black figures tumbling through the freezing air. Kowalski fired. Long bursts, burning through ammo. He didn't know if he hit anything. At 300 miles per hour, you just pointed and prayed. The bomber shook. A direct flak hit tore a hole in the left wing. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the waist compartment, slick and stinking. But the engines kept running. The wings stayed on. Rothman's voice crackled over the intercom. "Bomb bay doors open. 30 seconds to target." The plane steadied. The formation tightened. And below, through the smoke and flame, Hamburg waited. Frau Margarete Schiller stood in the doorway of her apartment on Rothenbach Chaussee, staring up at the sky. She had lived through the RAF raid the night before. The sirens, the explosions, the orange glow that turned midnight into noon. Her building had survived, but the street 2 blocks over was gone, just rubble and smoke and the smell of burning wood. Now, in the middle of the afternoon, the sirens wailed again. And this time, when she looked up, she saw them. The bombers didn't drop from the clouds. They were the clouds, a soured mass of metal moving with the slow certainty of an avalanche. She could hear the engines, a deep, droning roar that vibrated in her chest. People ran, some towards the shelters, others towards the basements. A few just stood and watched, paralyzed by the scale of it all. Marguerite clutched her daughter's hand and pulled her toward the U-Bahn entrance. But as they ran, she glanced back one last time. The bombs were already falling. At Flak Tower 4, Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich stood behind the breech of a 128mm gun, loading shell after shell with mechanical precision. He had been firing for 12 minutes straight. His ears were ringing, his hands were burned from hot brass, the gun barrel glowed dull red. And still, the bombers came. Each shell cost the Reich 200 Reichsmarks. Each one had to be manually loaded, aimed, and fired. The crew could manage 15 rounds per minute, a respectable rate for such a massive weapon. But there were over 1,000 bombers in the sky. Dietrich didn't need to do the math. He just kept loading. To his left, another gun jammed. The crew hammered at the breech with wrenches, cursing in frustration. Above, a B-17 trailing smoke peeled out of formation, losing altitude. The crew cheered until they saw 3 parachutes blossom from the stricken plane. 3 out of 10. Dietrich loaded another shell. The gun roared. The shell climbed into the sky, exploding somewhere in the black cloud of flak that now obscured the sun. He didn't see if it hit anything. He just kept loading.
Hamburg was not just another city. It was Germany's second-largest metropolis, home to over 1.7 million people. It was the Reich's gateway to the sea, a sprawling port on the Elbe River, with dockyards, U-boat pens, oil refineries, and munitions factories. It was the beating heart of Germany's naval war effort, and it had never been seriously threatened. Yes, the RAF had bombed it sporadically since 1940, but those were nuisance raids, a few dozen Lancasters dropping incendiaries in the dark, causing fires but little strategic damage. Hamburg's defenses were formidable. Flak towers mounted with 128mm guns, searchlight arrays, smoke generators, and a dense network of air raid shelters. The city's firefighting and civil defense units were among the best in Europe. But in the summer of 1943, the Allies were no longer interested in nuisance raids. Operation Gomorrah was designed as a combined offensive, the first true coordination between the RAF's Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force. The British would strike at night with incendiaries and high explosives, creating chaos and overwhelming the city's defenses. The Americans would follow up during the day with precision strikes on industrial targets, exploiting the confusion. The operation was named after the biblical city destroyed by fire from heaven. The symbolism was intentional. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, head of RAF Bomber Command, had long advocated for area bombing, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations to break German morale. Harris believed that if you burned enough cities, killed enough workers, and shattered enough homes, the German people would force Hitler to surrender. Whether that was moral, legal, or even effective was debated in London and Washington. But by 1943, the Allies had crossed a psychological threshold. Total war had become exactly that, total. Hamburg was chosen not just for its industrial value, but for its vulnerability. It was within range of both British night bombers and American day raiders. It was large enough to absorb thousands of tons of explosives. And critically, it lay near the North Sea, meaning Allied fighters could escort bombers part way, reducing early losses. On the German side, the defense of Hamburg fell to Luftflotte 3 and the local flak regiments. But by mid-1943, the Luftwaffe was stretched catastrophically thin. Thousands of fighters were deployed on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Air Force. Others defended the Rhine and the Ruhr. Pilot training had been slashed to save fuel. Experienced aces were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Worse still, German radar and early warning systems were beginning to fail. The British had developed a countermeasure called Window, strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers to confuse radar screens. It was crude, but devastatingly effective. When Window was deployed over Hamburg for the first time during Operation Gomorrah, German radar operators saw not dozens of bombers, but thousands of phantom contacts. the entire defense network collapsed into chaos. And so, on the morning of July 24, 1943, the first wave of RAF Lancasters roared across the North Sea toward Hamburg. By the time the sun rose on July 25th, the city was already burning. And that afternoon, as the smoke still climbed into the stratosphere, the Americans arrived. 1,000 strong. Angle 1. The pilot's perspective. Seeing the unthinkable. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Jonen had flown his first combat mission in 1940. Back then, dogfights were intimate. You saw the enemy's face through the cockpit. You watched his plane spiral into the earth. You felt the thrill and the horror in equal measure. But by 1943, air combat had changed. Now, when Jonen climbed into the cockpit of his Bf-110 night fighter, modified with radar, extra fuel tanks, and upward-firing cannons, he wasn't hunting individuals. He was engaging an industrial process. The bombers came in formations so dense they blotted out the stars. They flew so high that the cold could kill you before the bullets did. And they carried so much defensive firepower that a single mistake meant death. On the afternoon of July 25th, Jonen and his squadron were scrambled from Stade Airfield, just north of Hamburg. The orders were vague: intercept enemy formations approaching from the west. As he climbed through 15,000 feet, he saw the contrails first, long, straight, endless. Then he saw the shapes, hundreds of them, B-17s in tight combat boxes, staggered vertically and horizontally so that every bomber's guns covered another's blind spot. Jonen had attacked B-17s before. He knew their weaknesses: the underside of the nose, the gap between the tail and waist gunners. But those tactics assumed you were facing a dozen bombers, maybe 24. This was not that. They covered the entire sky, he would later write in his memoir. It was as if God himself had sent a plague of locusts made of steel. He made one pass, just one. Diving from above, cannon fire ripping into the tail of a straggler. The B-17 shuddered, trailing smoke, but did not fall. Return fire from a dozen turrets lit up the air around him. Tracers snapped past his cockpit like fireflies. His wingman exploded beside him, a direct hit to the fuel tank, gone in a flash of orange. Jonen pulled away, not out of cowardice, out of mathematics. There were too many of them. At Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin, General Oberst Hans Jeschonek stood before a wall map studded with pins. Each pin represented a fighter squadron. Most were red, committed to other fronts. A few were yellow, under strength or resting. Only a handful were green, combat ready and in position. The intelligence report on his desk was 3 hours old, but already obsolete. Estimated enemy bomber strength over Hamburg, 900+ aircraft. He set the paper down slowly. He had fought in the First World War. He had helped rebuild the Luftwaffe in secret during the 1930s. He had planned the air campaigns over Poland, France, and Britain. He understood logistics. He understood production. He understood what this number meant. Germany produced roughly 1,000 fighters per month. The Americans produced 5,000 bombers in the same period. 1,000 bombers over Hamburg today. How many tomorrow? How many next week? Yashonek walked to the window and stared out at the city. Somewhere in the distance, air raid sirens began to wail. He had no fighters to send, no reserves to call up, no miracle to conjure. For the first time in his career, General Oberst Franz Yashonek allowed himself to think the unthinkable. We cannot win this. At 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England, Brigadier General Curtis LeMay stood over a plotting table, watching red markers move across the map of northern Germany. Each marker represented a bomber group, each group 36 aircraft, each aircraft 10 men. LeMay didn't flinch when the reports came in. 3 bombers down over Cuxhaven, 5 more damaged, losses estimated at 7%. 7% was acceptable. LeMay had run the numbers. If you could destroy Germany's industrial capacity faster than it could rebuild, losses didn't matter. As long as the factories kept burning, as long as the U-boat pens crumbled, as long as the rail yard shattered, you were winning. The bombers were expendable. The crews were expendable. The mission was not. Confirmed target destruction, LeMay said, voice flat. An aide checked the radio traffic. Bombardiers report direct hits on Blum and Voss. Secondary explosions observed. LeMay nodded. Scheduled the next raid for July 27th. Same target. Doubled the tonnage. Someone asked, what if the Germans reinforce their defenses? LeMay didn't look up. Then we'll send more bombers. 3:14 p.m. 22,000 feet above Hamburg. The first wave of B-17s reached the initial point, the last navigation checkpoint before the bomb run. From here, the formation would fly straight and level for 6 minutes, giving the bombardiers time to line up their targets. 6 minutes. No evasive maneuvers, no deviations. 6 minutes of sitting still while flak exploded all around them. Lieutenant Rothman pressed his eye to the Norden bomb site, adjusting for wind speed and drift. Below, Hamburg was a smear of smoke and flame, the previous night's fires still burning. He could barely see the shipyard through the haze. Come on, he muttered, tweaking the crosshairs. The plane jolted. Flak burst directly beneath them, punching a hole through the bomb bay. Rothman felt the concussion in his teeth. Steady, he said into the intercom. Steady. The pilot's voice came back, tight with strain. You got 20 seconds, Danny, then we're getting the hell out of here. Rothman held his breath. The crosshairs drifted, settled, locked. Bombs away. The plane lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosive dropped free. Rothman looked down and watched the bombs tumble, tiny black shapes spinning toward Earth. He didn't see them hit. He was already releasing the next rack. Behind him, the bombardier in the next B-17 repeated the process, then the next, then the next. For 3 minutes, bombs rained down on the Blum and Voss shipyard. Factories collapsed, cranes toppled, U-boat hulls split open like eggshells. Fire bloomed in waves, rolling outward from the docks into the residential districts beyond. The destruction was surgical. The consequences were not. By 3:30 p.m., the first wave had turned for home, but the second wave was already inbound, and this time the Luftwaffe was ready. Major Hermann Graf, one of Germany's top aces, with over 200 kills on the Eastern Front, led a squadron of FW-190s from Jever Airfield. He had been held in reserve, waiting for the Americans to commit fully. Now, with the bomber stream stretched thin and climbing back toward the coast, Graf saw his opening. All aircraft, attack from the rear, target the stragglers, break formation and go in fast. The FW-190s dove. At 400 miles per hour, Graf closed on a damaged B-17, trailing smoke from its number 2 engine. The rear gunner saw him coming and opened fire, but Graf was already inside the cone of fire, too close to miss. He pressed the trigger. 20-millimeter cannon shells tore through the bomber's fuselage, shredding control cables and hydraulics. The tail section broke away. The plane flipped, corkscrewing into a flat spin. Graf didn't watch it fall. He was already lining up the next target. In less than 5 minutes, Graf's squadron claimed 8 bombers. But they paid for it. American P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, finally equipped with drop tanks that extended their range, arrived just in time. They fell on the German fighters like hammers, their .50 caliber machine guns ripping through wings and cockpits. Graf's wingman exploded in midair. Another pilot bailed out, his parachute trailing fire. Graf himself took hits to his engine cowling and barely made it back to base, wheels up landing in a field. The sky over Hamburg had become a slaughterhouse. By the time the American bomber cleared German airspace, the tally was staggering. American losses: 24 bombers destroyed, 17 more damaged beyond repair, 240 men killed or captured. German losses: 31 fighters destroyed, 19 pilots dead, 7 captured. But the shipyard was gone, the U-boat pens were burning, and the fires in Hamburg city center would rage for another week. That night, as Wilhelm Jonen climbed out of his cockpit at Stade Airfield, he didn't speak. His ground crew rushed over, patting him on the back, congratulating him for surviving another mission. But Jonen just walked past them, eyes vacant. He had seen the future, and it was a sky filled with American bombers. Across the airfield, the intelligence officer handed him a casualty report. Jonen scanned the names. Friends, men he had trained with. Gone. "They'll be back tomorrow," the officer said quietly. Jonen looked up. "We can't stop them." The officer didn't reply because he knew it was true. At 8th Air Force Headquarters, the mood was grim but determined. Yes, losses had been high. Yes, the raid had been costly. But the reconnaissance photos told the story. The Bloemen-Voss shipyard was crippled. Oil storage tanks were destroyed. Rail lines were severed. Hamburg would not build another U-boat for months. Schedule the next raid. In the ruins of Hamburg, Margarete Schiller dug through rubble with her bare hands. Her daughter was somewhere beneath the collapsed U-Bahn entrance. She had been holding her hand when the bombs hit. One moment she was there, the next, gone. Rescue workers tried to pull her away, but she fought them, screaming, clawing at the bricks. By dawn, they found the girl. She was still holding her mother's scarf. The climax of Operation Gomorrah was not a single moment. It was a cascade, a week-long apocalypse of fire, steel, and death. The RAF returned on the night of July 27th, dropping incendiaries that ignited a firestorm, a meteorological phenomenon where fires create their own wind systems, reaching temperatures of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Entire city blocks were incinerated in minutes. Asphalt streets melted. People caught in the open were suffocated by superheated air or burned to ash. The Americans followed again on August 29th, hitting what little remained of Hamburg's industrial core. By the time the raids ended on August 3rd, 42,000 civilians were dead. Another 37,000 wounded. 1 million were homeless. The city's infrastructure, water, power, transportation had ceased to exist. And in Berlin, in Moscow, in London, in Washington, the same question echoed. What happens when you can destroy an entire city in a week? The smoke over Hamburg was visible from 200 miles away. For weeks after the raids, ash fell like snow across northern Germany. Refugees streamed out of the city on foot, carrying whatever they could salvage. The Red Cross set up tent camps in the surrounding countryside, overwhelmed by the sheer number of displaced civilians. Hamburg had been the second largest city in Germany. Now, it was a necropolis. German authorities buried the dead in mass graves. Thousands more were never found, vaporized in the firestorm, or buried so deep beneath rubble that recovery was impossible. The exact death toll remains debated to this day. Conservative estimates place it at 42,000. Others suggest closer to 50,000. For comparison, the atomic bombing of Nagasaki killed approximately 40,000 people instantly. Hamburg, in 1 week, suffered equivalent destruction with conventional explosives. The psychological impact was seismic. For the German population, Operation Gomorrah shattered the illusion of safety. Up until that point, civilians in the interior of the Reich had believed the war was something happening out there, on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, at sea. Air raids were occasional nuisances, not existential threats. Hamburg changed that. Suddenly, every German city was vulnerable. Berlin, Munich, Cologne, Dresden, none were safe. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels tried to spin the disaster, declaring that Hamburg's sacrifice would steal the resolve of the German people. But even he knew it was a lie. Privately, Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The morale of the population has suffered a severe blow. If the enemy continues these attacks, we face catastrophe." Adolf Hitler reportedly flew into a rage when shown reconnaissance photos of Hamburg. He demanded immediate retaliation, vengeance raids on London using V-weapons, Vergeltungswaffen, or reprisal weapons. But the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets were still in development, and even when they became operational in 1944, they lacked the precision and destructive power to match what the Allies were unleashing. Germany could not hit back, not in the air, not at this scale, and everyone knew it. For the Luftwaffe, Operation Gomorrah was a strategic humiliation. Hermann Göring, who had promised Hitler that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin, was forced to confront the reality that his air force could no longer defend German airspace. Fighter production was prioritized, but it was a losing race. By 1943, German factories were producing roughly 1,000 fighters per month. The Allies were producing 5,000 bombers and 3,000 fighters in the same period. Worse still, pilot training was collapsing. In 1940, Luftwaffe pilots received over 200 hours of flight training before combat. By 1943, that had dropped to 100 hours. By 1944, some pilots were sent into battle with as few as 30 hours of training, barely enough to take off and land, let alone dogfight experienced Allied veterans. Attrition was brutal. In 1943 alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 8,000 pilots killed, wounded, or captured. Many were irreplaceable aces, men like Hans-Joachim Marcel and Werner Molders, whose experience and skill could not be replicated. German engineers scrambled to develop countermeasures. New fighter designs, the Focke-Wulf TA-152, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet, promised superior performance, but production delays, fuel shortages, and sabotage by forced laborers meant these aircraft arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, and every German pilot knew it. For the Allies, Operation Gomorrah was validation. The combined bombing offensive, RAF by night, USAAF by day, had proven devastatingly effective. The Americans had shown that daylight precision bombing, while costly, could destroy specific industrial targets. The British had shown that area bombing could break a city's ability to function. Together, they had created a blueprint for total war from the air. Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force immediately expanded operations. More airfields were built in England. More bomber groups arrived from the United States. Production of B-17s and B-24 Liberators accelerated. By the end of 1943, the Allies were launching raids with over 1,500 bombers at a time. Hamburg was not an exception. It was the beginning. But victory came at a price. American losses during Operation Gomorrah, 24 bombers shot down, 17 more damaged beyond repair, were deemed acceptable by High Command. But for the men who flew the missions, acceptable was a cold, bureaucratic word that meant nothing when your friends didn't come back. In the months following Hamburg, the 8th Air Force suffered horrific casualties. The raid on Schweinfurt in August 1943 saw 60 bombers destroyed in a single day, a loss rate of 20%. The raid on Regensburg cost another 24 aircraft. By October, some bomber groups had lost over 50% of their crews. Morale plummeted. The required number of missions for a bomber crew to complete a tour of duty was 25. Statistically, only 1 in 4 crews survived that long. The air war over Europe had become a meat grinder. But the Americans did not stop. They doubled down. New tactics were developed. fighter escorts, P-51 Mustangs with long-range fuel tanks, began accompanying bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Defensive formations were tightened, flak suppression improved, and slowly, inevitably, the balance shifted. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a credible threat. Allied bombers roamed German skies with near impunity. Cities burned, factories crumbled, the German war machine ground to a halt. For the survivors of Hamburg, there was no victory, only endurance. Frau Margareta Schiller buried her daughter in a mass grave on the outskirts of the city. She did not speak at the funeral. She did not cry. She simply stood, staring at the ground as the priest recited prayers in Latin. When the war ended 2 years later, Marguerite remained in Hamburg. She rebuilt, she worked, she lived, but she never forgot the sound of 1,000 bombers overhead, and she never forgave. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Jonen survived the war. He flew over 100 night missions, downing 34 Allied bombers. But after July 25, 1943, he never felt like a victor. In his post-war memoir, Duel under the Stars, Jonen wrote, "That afternoon over Hamburg, I realized we were not fighting men. We were fighting a force of nature. You cannot defeat a storm. You can only endure it or be destroyed by it." Jonen died in 2002, aged 80. He never stopped having nightmares about contrails. General Oberst Hans Jestrenek, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, committed suicide on August 18, 1943, less than a month after Operation Gomorrah. He left no note, but those who knew him said the defeat over Hamburg had broken him. Hermann Göring, furious at the loss, blamed Jestrenek for the Luftwaffe's failures. At the funeral, Göring refused to attend. The Luftwaffe never recovered. Curtis LeMay, the American general who orchestrated the daylight bombing strategy, went on to command the 20th Air Force in the Pacific, where he ordered the firebombing of Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens of other Japanese cities. He never expressed regret. When asked after the war if the destruction of Hamburg had been worth it, LeMay replied, "War is cruelty. You cannot refine it, you can only win it." July 25, 1943. 1,000 bombers over Hamburg. It was not the first city to burn. It would not be the last. But it was the moment when both sides understood the trajectory of the war. The Luftwaffe pilots who watched that silver tide roll across the sky knew, not intellectually, but viscerally, that the Third Reich had lost control of the air, and with it, control of the war. The age of air superiority had arrived, not through dogfights or aces, but through industrial might, through factories that could produce bombers faster than they could be shot down, through logistics that could replace entire squadrons in a week, through the cold, ruthless mathematics of total war. Operation Gomorrah was not just a bombing raid, it was a message. To Germany, you cannot win. To the Allies, victory will cost everything. And to history, this is what modern war looks like. In the decades since, scholars have debated the morality and effectiveness of strategic bombing. Some argue it broke German industrial capacity and shortened the war. Others claim it hardened civilian resolve and diverted resources from more decisive fronts. but standing in the cockpit of a Bf-110, watching 1,000 bombers blot out the sun, there was no debate. There was only the knowledge, certain, inescapable, final, that the fatherland was doomed. And that knowledge, more than any bomb, was the beginning of the end. And that knowledge, more than any bomb, was the beginning of the end. If this story moved you, make sure to like, subscribe, and press the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter of history. Comment your thoughts below and share this video with those who should remember what war truly means.